So thank you for joining us. This is a McLean and Company production of diversity, equity, and inclusion beyond the tipping point. As many of you know, McLean and Company is an HR research and advisory firm providing practical solutions to human resource challenges via executable research, tools, diagnostic, and advisory services that have a clear and measurable impact on your business. I encourage you to book a call with one of our analysts if you have any questions or concerns following this webinar. So thank you again for joining us. A few housekeeping rules really quickly. The first is to use the question and answer function. Use the question and answer function to post questions, comments, technical challenges, and such in the question and answer section to the right. You'll see it on the right of your screen. And our team will be monitoring the question and answer so we can answer some of your questions. We will also take some time at the end of the webinar today to also answer questions. In addition to our guest Ngozi, we have Uwa, and she will be the one monitoring and managing the chat. And you'll also see Paulo up there, and he is our technical assistant. So if you have any questions technically, you can put that in the question and answer section, and he will be happy to help you with that. Lastly, and certainly not least, we'll send a copy of the slides and recording of this webinar when it's complete. And although we don't have the capability to have the closed captioning during the actual webinar, the webinar deck and the recording will actually have closed captions. So thank you for joining us. So who are we? Who do we have here today? Today we have Ngozi Oke, and she's the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at NextRole, where she exhibits her passion for serving and empowering underrepresented communities by overseeing the development and execution of DEI initiatives. She has an extensive array of experience leading strategic initiatives. She's championed DEI work from Washington, D.C. to California, coast to coast, and in various industries, including the mortgage banking and now marketing and technology. Ngozi is also the editor for the practicalesg.com publication, where she delivers content to help leaders operationalize DEI throughout their organizations. She earned a master's degree in HR management with an emphasis on DEI from Georgetown University, and not one, but two bachelor's degrees from University of California, San Diego. Ngozi's goals are simple. She aspires to impact the world by increasing equity to opportunities for marginalized communities and by being the best mom, wife, daughter, and sister that she can be. Welcome, Ngozi. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Cinnamon. It's a pleasure to be here.
And my name is Cinnamon Clark. I am the practice lead for all things diversity, equity, and inclusion here at McLean and Company. I lead the development and the delivery of all client-facing services with relation to DEI. I joined McLean about 1 year ago. I come from the United States government, worked a lot of high-level DEI initiatives, and just really excited to be part of McLean and be able to have the opportunity to be part of the solution for so many of our clients and our organizations when it comes to understanding diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as understanding practical ways in which inclusion and diversity and equity show up in the workplace. So it's a pleasure to be here. Again, if you joined us a little bit late, you'll see two other folks on the call today, and that'll be Paulo. He is our technical assistant. He's the tech guy. And then we have Uwa, and she is going to be managing the question and answer section of the webinar. So again, if you have questions, go ahead and place those in the Q&A section on the right-hand side of your screen, and we will move on. So today our objectives are simple, right? We're going to share some insights from the 2022 HR Trends Report with regard to workplace diversity, equity, and inclusion. Second, we'll hear thoughts and advice on practical actions for creating a more inclusive workplace without focusing on compliance. And lastly, we will hear the amazing story of Ngozi on her journey to becoming a leader in the DEI space. She has some really good advice and some really practical tips, so I'm excited to dig into that conversation today. So the why. Why is diversity, equity, and inclusion important? And the next few slides you'll see here are stats and data that McLean and Company captures every year. This year, McLean and Company's 2022 HR Trends Report is an online survey that over 800 business professionals in approximately 13 different industries took. And what you'll see here is in 2020, DEI was number 4 on the list. Excuse me, in 2021, it was number 4 on the list. But in 2022, it dropped to number 5. So what I'd like to make note of, though, is that providing a great employee experience was number 5 in 2020 and 2021, but jumped to number 2 in 2022. And really, I think that you'll see employee experience has a lot to do with inclusion. And so you'll see that a little bit, but we'll dig into that when I get into the conversation with Ngozi and some of her experiences with the employee experience and inclusion in the workplace. So this slide shows that organizations continue to report that they are focusing on DEI. In fact, 62% of those polled report that DEI have been added to their HR portfolio. The number of respondents stating that DEI is not a focus continues to drop. In 2021, it was, or excuse me, in 2020, it was 25%. In 2021, it was 6%. And in 2022, it was down to just 5%. Organizations that aren't focusing on creating an environment of DEI are experiencing 1.6 times more voluntary turnover than those that are focused on it. Potential explanations for this include increased employee and candidate expectations regarding the organization's commitment to DEI, increased likelihood that the employee experience inequities and lack of inclusion and other DEI challenges will make them more likely to leave. So organizations that are not focusing on DEI and inclusive work practices have a higher chance that their employees will actually voluntarily leave. The reported focus on DEI is not backed by concrete actions to address systemic issues. Some actions that organizations are taking to create an environment of DEI. So you'll see on this slide right here, clearly articulating the link between DEI and organizational goals. Also providing DEI training to employees, and down 2% from 2021, evaluating inclusive behaviors throughout the performance appraisal process for leaders, down to -4%, embedding inclusive practices and behaviors in the values and competencies in the organization, down 6%, purposefully establishing diverse project teams across the organization, and down 7%, identifying and addressing pay inequities for underrepresented groups. And this is clearly articulating the fact that DEI is not actually reflected in the concrete actions and the systemic issues inside of organizations. So as we all saw in 2020 and the call to action following the murder of George Floyd, there was a huge momentum. Everybody was super excited. Everybody was ready to make change. And just under 2 years later, we're seeing that the momentum is lost, that diversity, equity, and inclusion is not at the forefront of the conversation like it was before. And I can't help but wonder, and Ngozi and I'll talk about this a little bit later, the why behind that. Is it because there's not media attention? What is the reason behind that? And we'll talk about it a little bit, but as the momentum's lost, even the surface level issues are being overlooked. Right? So what are those things? Actions that organizations are taking to create an environment of DEI. So purposefully sourcing groups of candidates. It's down to 32% just from last year, and the previous year, 17%. Tracking and reporting on DEI metrics. It was up at 42% last year, and now it's at 36%. Creating employee resource groups. 32%, now down to 30, and recognizing employees for inclusive behaviors. That has actually increased over last year, which was 17%, and now 19%. It's important to note that even short-term reactive initiatives taken last year are becoming less common this year. So what's the result of that? These actions have no association with organizational outcomes, and it's clear that more work and foundational work is needed and necessary. Taking just a few of these actions for a single year will not create sustainable change in your DEI journey. What it requires is strategic and ongoing action that moves beyond diversity alone and addresses the culture and equity and inclusion. Without this, organizations risk their integrity in their DEI initiatives. And honestly, folks, it comes off as performative rather than impactful. So organizations are facing several challenges that are limiting actual and lasting change. The first is realizing that diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's not just one thing, but it is three separate elements that work together. Sometimes they're intersectional, sometimes they work in silo, and sometimes they work together, but it's a journey, right? And, oftentimes we hear people say that they're looking for quick wins. Well, that's fine, but what is the sustainability plan? What is the long-term goal? What is the journey? What does that look like? What is the end goal? So DEI is a journey. While organizations that are high performing in DEI are definitely more likely to be struggling to allocate adequate resources and funds. We're committed to it, but we're not committing to the funds. We're not committed to the resourcing. We're expecting people to do this off the side of their desk. And that's unfortunate because it is important to allocate the right resources to the journey, right? Also, organizations must realize that it is important to, they have to understand that when they're low performing in DEI, the challenge is often lack of leadership buy-in. So organizations that are low performing in DEI are more likely to list that there's not a whole lot of leadership buy-in. We all know that leadership, once they're bought in, then if it's their priority, it's the organizational priority. So we need that leadership buy-in when it comes to any type of diversity, equity, inclusion policy, program, initiatives, and the like. And as you see here, leadership buy-in is on the decline. Only 42% of organizations have leadership that's committed to modeling inclusive behavior and championing DEI initiatives. Progress in DEI will continue to stall if practices remain focused on compliance rather than rooted in strategy. So what does that mean? If we're focusing on the checklist, if we're focusing on the legislated requirements, if we're focusing on the things that people outside of the organization tell us to do, that's not really sustainable, right? We can bring as many people as we want into the organization, but the only thing that we can control is how they experience the organization. If we're not fostering an inclusive environment, then we're not going to be able to retain that talent. And we've seen that with the Great Resignation. We've seen that in the call to action and the huge turnover of folks over the last almost 2 years since the pandemic began, since the murder of George Floyd in June 2020. So only 38% of the respondents reported having a formal DEI strategy. This is the same as it was in 2021. Organizations without a strategy run the great risk for missing out on key benefits to an inclusive work environment. The DEI strategy is associated with improved DEI performance and social and environmental sustainability performance. According to the survey, again, we're referring to the HR Trend Survey from McLean and Company, only 13% of respondents have an overarching DEI strategy in place that's aligned with the employee life cycle. We have to understand that at each level of at each step of the employee life cycle, there are opportunities to be inclusive, to leverage diversity, and to build equity into the whole process. Folks experience your organization long before they become employees. They may have family members. There may be any number of ways that they experience your organization long before they become employees. And it's important to know that what they're seeing before they get in is just as important as when they're leaving the organization or an employee of the organization. Two out of five respondents say that their organization is focused on DEI practices that are focused on mainly compliance. Compliance is not enough. So there are three fundamental elements that organizations must focus on to sustain and continue progress in DEI on that journey that we talked about earlier. Leadership buy-in, that's probably the most important element of any DEI journey or any organizational priority. Governance is equally important, and strategy. 58% of respondents do not have leadership buy-in that's committed to modeling inclusive behaviors and and modeling those inclusive behaviors and championing support for DEI. 70% of the respondents say that they do not have a DEI governance framework. So there's no accountabilities assigned. Nobody knows who does what inside of the organization when it comes to DEI. And lastly, 62% of respondents do not have a formal DEI strategy, as we've discussed. So that leads us to our guest today. Ngozi is here to talk about what is the tipping point. As diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioners, we have experienced a lot of change. We've experienced a lot of like aha moments. And so I'm just wondering, what is the tipping point? And so we'll talk about that in just a moment. But I'm going to turn it over to my guest, Ngozi, and just let her, introduce herself, some introductory remarks, and tell us, what is your why?
Yeah, thank you, Cinnamon. And it's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. Thanks for having me. And as Cinnamon mentioned, I am currently the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Nextral, which is a marketing technology company. I'm also the editor of one of the editors at practicalesg.com, where I deliver DEI content to help operationalize it throughout your organization. And I actually, prior to these roles that I have now, I worked in mortgage banking, also heading up diversity, equity, and inclusion. And mortgage banking, very similar to the tech industry, has a lot of work to do in terms of creating more diversity within the organizations and within the industry as a whole. Actually, even prior to mortgage banking, I think I've had an interesting background in diversity, equity, and inclusion. I actually began this work not in a titled DEI role, but in working in various community organizations that gave me really great insight, like on the ground, around how diversity, equity, and inclusion really impacts the different communities. I think sometimes when we say DEI, it feels really abstract, right? And we talk about it in the workplace, and we throw around these terms. It's really been helpful for me to have the background, such as working at the NAACP Economic Education Center, where as a project I worked to deliver economic education really aimed at bridging the wealth disparity that we see in underrepresented communities, and also working at Congresswoman Susan Davis's office in San Diego. Cinnamon and I have that in common. We go back to San Diego, and working at Congresswoman Susan Davis's office really to connect with minority-owned businesses and women-owned businesses to understand what they were experiencing, right? What types of challenges they were experiencing, and then to advocate, on behalf of them to improve really their opportunities for sort of financial wellness, really within their opportunities within their organizations, to get the support that they needed, and really to improve their odds, when we know that minority-owned businesses and women-owned businesses, there aren't really there aren't a ton of resources available, and in terms of competition with, oftentimes larger organizations, right? They often do lose out. And so just understanding what some of those challenges were really helpful. And then, in addition to other experiences along the way, I ended up, when I moved to DC, I ended up working in mortgage banking. That's sort of where I transitioned into mortgage banking. And that was really insightful, because that's really where I got exposed to learning about the history of home ownership in America, and how that has been instrumental in creating the wealth gap that we see, right? The opportunity gaps that we see that really still persist and have shaped the country as we see it today. And so that, was, I think, a pivotal moment for me to understand that, at least at that moment, I really wanted to have an impact in, bridging, those opportunities for underrepresented communities, and, increasing home ownership rates for Black communities, for Latinx, Hispanic communities, right, for Asian communities, in order to create more generational wealth, right? And so that's sort of where some of my journey began. And then I found myself within the DEI space, both working to help increase homeownership rates for underrepresented communities, but also sort of cultivating an understanding within the organization of what the needs are, right? An understanding of sort of the lack of diversity within the industry and within the workforce, and how that directly impacts the work that the organization does. So that's a little bit about my career history. And in terms of my why, right, that was the next question. So I find that I have a different why at, different stages in my life. Very early on, I, so, I'm an immigrant. Right, I came here very young, along with my mom and my sister, and we came here about a year or two after my dad came here, and I remember hearing stories after we came here. He really worked to make sure that he sent money back until we were able to come. And I remember hearing stories from him around how he would work. At the time, I think he was working two full-time jobs and a part-time job. And I learned work ethic from my dad. He is, just incredibly driven, an incredible hard worker. And he would tell me just stories about the racism that he experienced in the workplace, how he would, train people and manage people that were immediately paid more than he was, right? He would tell me stories about how, and he lived in Florida at the time, and he would tell me stories about how, he would get stopped by the police, and, especially if it was late at night, or if it was in an isolated location, the type of fear that would run through him, and those stories really left a remarkable impression on me, right? And so it made me really want to create a better environment. Now that I've got a Black son, I've got a Black husband, I know that the work that I do within the workplace directly impacts the world that they live in. And to be quite honest, I think that even my perspective on life early on, being an immigrant, my parents made it very clear that we came from Nigeria to America in order to have a better life, to have, a greater opportunity at success, right? To have better health care, to have better education. And of course, growing up here, it's interesting to learn that, while the circumstances are better in Nigeria, better here than in Nigeria, right? There is in fact plenty of inequity here in the educational system, right? There's plenty of inequity here within the healthcare system. And I've sort of been on the receiving end of that actually quite recently, which I'm happy to share. And so I think understanding that also helped me realize, okay, well then my purpose is not just to come here and be a recipient of that sort of like better life. I want to create that for others. And so I think those were my really early whys, really just shaped the trajectory of what I became interested in. And so very early on, I, interned and took on projects and worked really with communities to understand what the issues were and to advocate and to work on behalf of our communities, right? Um, and then, fast forward recently, I'd say that there's been maybe not a transition in my why, but maybe an addition to my why. In 2020, so 2020, a little bit of quick story time. 2020, I got married, I got pregnant, and I remember experiencing headaches. And I wasn't prior to being pregnant. Now I kind of have some headaches, but prior to being pregnant, I didn't really, I didn't have headaches, didn't really have migraines. That wasn't really an issue for me. So I did feel like something was wrong. And I would, you know, uh, communicate this to my OBGYN at the moment, and I would be completely dismissed. At that time, I was also experiencing, I was also in like the toxic work environment, right? So there was a lot of stress and anxiety that also wasn't healthy, right? And so I did seek therapy, and perhaps because therapists didn't look like me, right? I was immediately dismissed. My concerns were dismissed, right? And so at 25 weeks, I ended up having an emergency where, apparently this whole time I had preeclampsia, and at 25 weeks it escalated into severe preeclampsia, and so I was rushed to the hospital, and my son had to be delivered, and he was a 1 pounder. He was 1 pound, his tiny little baby, and he almost lost his life, and I almost lost my life,
Yeah.
um, and he spent over 4 months in the NICU. And, I'm very grateful now that he's home and he's okay. And I'm home and I'm okay. But that to me was a very real experience, right?
Yeah.
Of what it feels um, to be unheard, to be unseen in the healthcare system, what it feels for my health to be in jeopardy, for being a Black woman, right?
Yeah.
What it feels for me to express concern about my health, right? Because we know our bodies,
Absolutely.
what it is to express concern about my physical health and my mental health, and, completely be dismissed, and the health impacts of that. Right. And so when we look at health disparities, like, the mortality rates, in for Black women, right, or Black babies, and we see
Yes.
the disparity there, that's a huge why for me, right? I mean, it,
Right.
I'm not working in the healthcare industry, but I do feel very strongly that the work that I do in the workplace really does impact our physical and mental health,
Yeah.
which does have real life impacts, and it can be life and death, right? And in my
Yeah.
situation, it nearly was. And so my why now is really about creating environments to make sure that other Black, Indigenous people of color are healthy, right? That they're healthy
Yeah.
in the places where they work, that they're
Absolutely.
healthy in the places, where they find themselves, so that they can also be healthy outside of work. And
Yeah.
so that's a bit about my why.
Thank you so much for sharing. And, you know, I really think that there are people listening to you tell your story and they connect with that. But there are other people that are saying, well, why would she say it's because she's Black or that they're underrepresented, right? And so if you don't mind, just kind of dig into that just a little bit deeper. And I'm going to give an example before you dig into it. Those that are listening, and Guzzy and I kind of talked about this a little bit, but do you remember the image maybe about a month ago on social media? And it was the pregnant mom, and you could see the baby, and it was like a side slice of what the anatomy of a pregnant woman looked, but it was Black. it was represented in brown, and it went viral. And those of you listening, if you did not see it, I think you should look it up, because you want to know why it went viral. It went viral because that was the first time that people of color saw a depiction of the anatomy of a Black woman carrying a Black child or a brown child or anything other than the standard, European child and image. And it was a big deal to the community because, one, representation matters, right? Inclusive images and all of those things. So there has to be some embedded feelings and embedded barriers and biases in just that alone. So when you talk about your story and you tell us and you say something, you say that, you feel as though, or you experience these things, tell us why. Tell us why you think or why you feel this I'm sorry, I'm at a loss for words, because that story is just, it's all too common, but it's also one of those things that we feel deeply, right? So I'm at a little bit of a loss for words, but what I'm asking is, why do you feel it was because you were a Black woman seeking care and being dismissed? Because there are folks that'll say, well, why did she pull the race card?
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. So, and a couple of things that I'm happy to talk about there. One, is that we have the data, really. We have the data, and lots of other verbal experiences that will let us know that this is a real thing, right? So,
Yeah.
all it takes is a bit of research to really to show the health disparities that do exist and the impacts of that. And so we've got the numbers really to show that. I will tell you though that I've been a part of several forums for Black women, like Facebook groups of Black women, and some of them have had similar experiences to me. And there's been moments where I've sat and I've read through all of their experiences, right? Experiences that are very similar to mine, having expressed symptoms. And quite honestly, headaches, though, that's like textbook preeclampsia symptoms.
Absolutely.
It's not like a something that's really unknown. You could Google it and it would pop up. It'd be like, oh yeah,
Yeah.
if you're a pregnant Black woman, you are, more prone to preeclampsia. So you have to look out for headaches and a couple of other things, right? Um, and so and so reading some of these stories from other Black women where
Hmm.
they also expressed themselves and they were and they were sort of unheard, right? And in
Yeah.
many instances, they lost their child. And in
Yeah.
some instances, they were in that form because they actually lost a loved one, right? Their sister or daughter or mother lost their life as a result of this, right? And so to me, data just means information. That's
Yes.
what I've been taught, right? Is
Yeah.
like data is information. And so some of that is numbers, which we can find in this instance. That's great. And however, some of it is experience. And when we talk about
Yes.
diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think that we want to validate people's experiences. And so when, we read these narratives of how, people are being failed by, our health
Yes.
systems,
Yeah.
we need to believe them, right? And then also, just really quickly, in my instance, actually, I called the OBGYN's office and asked, if I like, can I switch doctors? And the person I spoke with at the time asked me a couple of questions, and I told her like, here was my experience, and she said, oh, yeah, you're not the first one to have told us something like this, right?
Oh my.
So there's some validation there, right?
Yeah.
That there's really an
Yes.
issue that I'm not the first one, may not be the last
Yeah.
one, right? Um, and so um, and so those are some of the
Yeah.
reasons where I feel confident that I can say that yes, it was
Yeah.
because I was a Black woman. I am I I am grateful that
Absolutely.
that my son and I are both okay, right? And it's good news at the end of the day.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. And, you know, we often learn by people's lived experience, but it's so easy for folks to discount or dismiss other people's experience. And I think when we start talking about embedding inclusion and being inclusive leaders and being inclusive humans, it's important to understand the lived experience of the folks around you as opposed to how you experience the world. So as we transition into the tipping point, what is the tipping point? I will say from my own personal experience, I worked for the government for 20 some odd years, both in uniform and outright. And I remember after George Floyd was murdered, I was asking about making a statement to the organization, and it kind of got kicked around it was 2 weeks. And it kind of got kicked around. And finally, I was asked to write the statement on behalf of the organization. And so I asked my then boss at the time, I was like, hey, can I get a few moments on basically the CEO's calendar, 5 minutes, to talk to him about the intent and the tone? And at that time, my then boss, who was a non-practitioner, non-DEI practitioner, he told me, Cinnamon, the boss doesn't have time for every little thing. And so for me, having been doing this work for a long time, being a brown woman from Arizona, where I've often been one of one, and even in my time in the United States Navy being one of one, it was a challenge for me to hear that, because that was the most pivotal moment in my professional life where I was like, wow, he doesn't have time for every little thing. Wow, my life, the people that look like me, is every little thing. And for me, that was one of those ahas. And I stepped back from that conversation. I was crying. I called a friend. I was like, bro, this is not for me. And in that moment, I knew that it was time for me. That was my call to action, right? And I knew that I wanted to be part of the solution. We probably will not see a bigger civil rights movement than we've seen in the last 2 years, essentially. The time is now. And for me, it was a call to action. And I've noticed quite a bit of the folks that have been in the DEI space, working in the DEI space, turn over jobs, turn over roles, and move organizations. And, that to me is a tipping point. We see the mass resignation that's underway. We see the call to action for organizations in social, environmental action and responsibility. We see the call to action for inclusive work environments. And so there are a number of reasons that we've seen online, we've read articles, there's plenty of research about why people are leaving the workplace. Let's talk about the tipping point. Why are people leaving? What is the why? Why are we doing this? What is the call to action? How? Well, we'll talk about how a little bit later, but what is the tipping point as you see it?
Yeah, so when you mention people who transitioned into new work opportunities during the pandemic, I was one of those people. So I do um, really resonate, I think, with the feeling of the masses on this one.
Yeah,
And I think that there's a couple of different things going on, quite honestly. I think one of the things that we're experiencing is really a reevaluation of our relationship with work,
yeah,
um, a sort of a reassessing of like um, what we want for ourselves, what balance looks like. For some folks, and the data shows that for primarily women are actually leaving the workforce altogether, right? Because of sort of, childcare duties and things like that, and being primary primary caretakers in the home in a world where so much of the sort of external resources, right, like schools and daycares really had shut down. And even now it's pretty inconsistent, right? Like every other week, my son's daycare shuts down, right? And so I think we're rethinking whether we even want to balance the two, quite honestly, whether we can, right? Whether it's like healthy for us to do so. And then for some folks, they're saying, well, yeah, I'm okay with balancing work and life, but I need a workplace that better aligns with my values. Um, and that was the case for me.
yeah,
It's interesting because I think that I've been thinking a lot about commutes to work because I feel like commute to work has actually, it actually creates a kind of a buffer that allowed a lot of us to persist in different companies that
Yeah.
maybe, we didn't love for a long time.
Mhm.
And so I think the commute to work, so, it sort of helps you to ramp up and get ready for that shift in the environment.
Yeah.
The commute to home kind of helps us to, de-stress and, sort of shift, our mental state and prepare ourselves from home. And nevertheless, there was a boundary either way, right? At least to an extent, at least it's sort of a physical boundary that we could speak to. And I think that during the pandemic, the way of working has shifted. Many of us, had to work from home all of a sudden. And so there was no longer that boundary, right? And so, work was in our kitchen, right? For some of us, like my office is my breakfast nook. So work is in our home, it's in our living room, it's in our bedrooms, right? And so there's no longer that boundary. And I think it becomes much more difficult to tolerate a work environment that doesn't value us, that doesn't align with our values to begin with. And so I think that that's a little bit of what we're seeing, right? Just some intolerance, right? We're saying no, we're going to find a better place. If this is what we're going to do, let's find an organization that actually really does care about me and what I care about. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah, I think that's a bit of what we're seeing.
Absolutely. I was just reading an article last night and it was talking about the time saved between the commute and the things that we normally do to get ourselves ready for the office. And it was talking about how, average Americans, and this was male and female, save about 9 minutes a day on, getting dolled up, makeup, shaving, putting on deodorant. I think that was even mentioned in the article, all of that kind of thing that has shifted from the work and home environment. And that's so true. That buffer that you talk about, separating, the work day from the home day and all of that. And, the pandemic specifically has exposed some pretty significant excuse me, inequities when it comes to all of the things that you've already talked about, but also the workplace. You talked about childcare responsibilities, elder care responsibilities, and all of those other infrastructure type things that we rely upon are now unstable, as you mentioned, and it's very challenging to navigate a work environment that's not inclusive of those types of lifestyles, that's not very flexible. And those are all inclusion practices, inclusion policies that could easily be built into the organizational culture. And organizations are risking it all to not change, and now we see this huge turnover of folks inside of the workplace. And specifically, like you said, the pandemic has had an alarming effect on women. I think I was reading that in the pandemic, 64 million women lost jobs or left jobs in between 2020 and 2021, and which is about 5% of the total jobs held by women. And by contrast, 3.9% men lost their jobs in that same year, which is insane, right? That it's disproportionately impacting women. And so, you know the tipping point, let's what are some ways that you think that the organizations are missing the point and missing the opportunity, if you will, to bring in diverse talent, to keep and retain and attract diverse talent when it comes to and diversity, equity, and inclusion. We all the time I hear clients tell me, Cinnamon, we need to increase our talent acquisition pool because we need more diversity. We need more, racial, ethnic, whatever diversity. And my first thing is when you get the talent, what are you going to do with it? How are you going to build an inclusive environment? And so, from your experience, what do you think are some ways that organizations can bring in that talent and actually cultivate an inclusive environment for them?
Yeah, so I do think there are a couple of ways, but before I get into those even, I think the issue of women leaving the workplace, I think for us DEI practitioners, it's particularly concerning, right? Because
Yeah.
we're on our way to, to helping and closing the wage gap. We haven't gotten there yet, right? There's still a promotion gap when we look at, who is occupying, seats in executive and senior level leadership and boards, right? We, still have a ways to go to make sure that we've got sort of gender parity there. And so it
Yes.
does feel, with sort of the mass exodus especially women leaving the workforce, it does feel a little like, oh, okay, we've got to figure out a way to rebuild. Um,
Yes.
and I think that to that, I mean, I think that there are organizations that are really, really trying to figure it out, honestly. I mean, I think that the pandemic has really thrown everyone, right? This is sort of something that we have never experienced before. And I think organizations are really trying to, for the most part, from, my peers in the industry, from what I've been reading and what I've been seeing out there, like organizations really trying to figure out how to give employees what they need in order to be successful, even in this new landscape that we find ourselves. Um, I think that a couple of things that
Mhm.
organizations can do. One is just being embracing the flexibility of the moment. I think that this more virtual environment it's not going to leave once the pandemic is over. I think it's here to stay, right?
Yes.
And so, for companies that are sort of that maybe don't have the business need, maybe haven't demonstrated the business need, but are requiring their employees to come back into the office. I
Yes.
think that's going to be an issue for them in retaining their workforce, right? So I think really understanding and embracing flexibility and what that looks like, right? Asynchronous working is going to need to be, really important for us to understand and figure out a way to work around. So understanding that flexibility, I think that it's going to be key, like committing to it
Absolutely.
I think it's going to be key. And I think another is really around providing the the benefits and resources that employees need right now. I mean, making sure that the health benefits are comprehensive and really serve the needs of your employees and your diverse workforce. I think
Yes.
is very important. But also exploring mental health options as well. One of the things that I really love about what Nextrol has done is really understood that burnout is real right now, right? Like we talk about the commute has been a buffer. Now we're working during our commute, right? Like,
Yes.
so we are essentially working more
Yes.
and juggling a lot. I mean, I know parents that are also teaching their kids at home, so it's like you're working two jobs at the same time,
Yes.
right? Like at least.
Yes.
And so we're doing more working, and so there the burnout and the mental health implications of that, I think, is something that as employers, maybe I think employers haven't in the past really taken it really perhaps haven't believed that it's within their wheelhouse of what they really should care about, right? Mental health feels
Yeah.
personal to an extent. But I
Yeah.
think that now employers are going to want to embrace mental health and really understand what services they need to provide. And so to sort of close out my loop on what I was
Yeah.
mentioning, one thing that I really like that Nextral has done about this is really understood that like burnout is a real thing. Mental health issues are something that that data shows us is on the rise right now. And
Yes.
so they have provided, different resources, including the Calm app, right? Like,
Yeah.
Rollers, which is Rollers, kind of the title we give our employees at Nextrol, all
Yeah.
have access to a Calm app, which, gives you options to
Yeah.
meditate and, sleep, help and all of those things that you can use on your own time, but also Modern Health, which has been great. Like Modern Health is this mental health service that provides
Mhm.
coaching services and also therapy, right? So every employee actually has access to a therapist and to a coach. And I think that that is that's amazing to me, right? It's
Yeah.
amazing to me for organizations to venture into this space,
Yeah.
and to say, dig our heels in and say, we're going to provide the services that we know our employees need right now, even if it, hasn't historically been provided, even if it feels a little non-traditional, even if it feels like we're, maybe stepping into their personal life a little bit. And the truth is that, work is in our breakfast nook now. So work is in our personal lives, right? And so I
Yeah.
think it's very appropriate, and something that I'm quite proud of, that Nextral has embraced.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing. And we're going to roll into some questions, but I just want to tie that up a little bit. You know, if your employees are not good to themselves, if they're burnt out, if they're languishing, if they're going through things, they're not going to be good for the organization. So organizations like yours, Next Role, leaning into that blurred line that historically has been there, is only going to reap the benefits for employees, the families of employees, and that continues to spread. And proves itself to be a best practice when it comes to the overall wellness and the employee experience. Because if we're not good for ourselves, we can't be good to anybody else. So thank you for that. I have a few questions that I seen pop up, so I'm just going to drop a couple of those in there. Um, Let me see. So there's one that, do you find that the hybrid workforce, or excuse me, workplace today, has forced the equity portion of DEI to the forefront? And I will say that I literally just got done reading another article about this, about how women of color, specifically Black women, are happier in the work from home environment because there's a lot of emotional real estate that is taken up by the microaggressions, by just navigating, getting into the office, just making sure that your hair is appropriate, making sure that you are presenting in a way that is appropriate for the environment. And the emotional toll, the emotional real estate that just navigating the world as, as a racialized person, as somebody that's a little bit different from the majority inside of an organization, takes up so much time and so much like mental bandwidth. And so in this hybrid work environment, do you think that that's brought the equity portion to the forefront of the conversation? And we have about 8 minutes left for the conversation.
Yeah, and I think that that's a great question, because I do think a hybrid work model does present some issues in equity, when we
Yes.
think about who is visible and who is rewarded for that. I think that that's something that that has been at the forefront of my mind for quite a
Yeah.
bit. So in terms of, hybrid work model, right, we're recognizing that that means that you're going to have some employees in the office in person, some employees working from home, some employees sort of fluctuating between the two, right?
Yeah.
And I do think that when we think about, bias, right, we, the bias that jumps more immediately to mind that could easily show up in this sort of setup is proximity bias, right? And so that's where we are associating and rewarding those who are in closer proximity to us, right? So so maybe if the manager is in the office, right, the employees that also show up to the office on that team are seen as
Yeah.
harder working, right? They're seen as, maybe they run into each other in the kitchen and start talking about a project that nobody's heard of yet, right? And they get
Yeah.
additional insight, right, into different projects, and get all of those different things, which, really does translate down the line, right, into sort of opportunities for promotion, right, opportunities to move up the ladder in the workplace. And so I think it is a real concern. However, one of the ways that I think that we can address this is by, because I do, and I'll mention later why I think that a hybrid work model like is why I think it is, it is valuable.
Yes.
But I think that one way that we can combat proximity bias is by having a screen first or a virtual first um, sort of framework for all
Uh-huh.
things, right? So for all meetings, you sort of prioritize the virtual experience, right? So all
Mhm.
work events, need to happen virtually.
Yeah.
All trainings need to happen virtually. All meetings need to happen virtually first. So even folks who are in the office, they go to their cube and they have that meeting in front of their screen, right?
Yeah.
That way we try to keep, as much of, like, we try to sort of control the environment a little bit more to make sure that we aren't having that bias sort of come through. I think it's probably imperfect, and we'll need to figure out in the future how we'll fix this,
Yes.
or address it or improve our framework. However,
Absolutely.
I am particularly drawn to a hybrid model. I think because I like the option for employees to come into an office where possible. I remember
Yeah.
at the beginning of the pandemic, I was reading research about the spike in domestic violence that occurred once a lot of workplaces went virtual,
Yes.
because for some people, going to work actually was an escape from a toxic home
Absolutely.
environment, right?
Yeah.
And so having a place where folks can go to as an option, I think can prove to actually be healthy for some folks as well. And so I think that's why I do sort of lean towards a hybrid work model, because I see the value in it for safety, for some folks psychological safety, for some folks physical safety.
Yeah.
Like sometimes that's very helpful as an option.
Absolutely. Thank you. So we have time for one last question, but I'm going to ask you for any advice that you would like to give practitioners or anybody listening today about anything that you choose. So over to you to give us some wisdom.
Oh, so you know what? I think that something that I feel very strongly about, I think because of my experiences as well over the last 2 years, for DEI practitioners or anybody that's wanting to enter this space, my advice would be to be very intentional about the organization that you join, right? Because
Yes.
oftentimes, those of us doing this, DEI work, we are Black, Indigenous people of color. Oftentimes we're
Yes.
women, right? So we
Yeah.
already have a lot of different things that we're dealing with, and we want to make sure not to enter an environment that is going to exacerbate that. And
Yes.
so, you mentioned, some of the data that you mentioned, Cinnamon. I was like, oh no, like I want to make sure that we are making progress, right? Like as a sort of business community, we're making more progress towards DEI, and it's a little disheartening to see that for many organizations that's not happening. I do think DEI practitioners, though, want to ask those questions up front. So as you're interviewing an organization, with an organization, you're also interviewing the organization, right?
Yes.
Ask about
Yes.
leadership buy-in, right? Make sure that executive leadership is bought in, because if they're not bought in, it's not going to work, right? Make sure that you are resourced, right? Make sure that you are going to be empowered to do the work that you're being hired to do, right?
Absolutely.
So just research those things so that you make sure that when you get into that environment, you are set up for success, and you find yourself in an organization that truly wants to do this work and will support you leading this work. I think that's important for mental health, for physical health.
Yes.
And I
Yes.
think that it's, something that through my experience, I have learned. And so I want, sort of everyone in this space to find themselves in a place where they are supported and they are healthy doing this work.
Absolutely. Thank you. Because it takes so much resilience and just so much out of us to do this work. It's very emotionally taxing. So I want to thank you for having this conversation with me and just being so transparent and really, really talking through some of the things that we see. Of course, we could keep it going for hours. And I just really enjoyed your willingness to share with us some of the things that you've done, your experience, and how you got to where you are today, and also the story about the lack of representation or empathy in the medical field that you experience, and that a lot of people that are considered marginalized or underrepresented actually experience, and our call to action, the tipping point, right?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And we didn't get to all of the questions, but we'll be able to answer some of those with the slide deck. So Thank you again. Here at McLean & Company, we have a number of supporting resources to include strategy building for diversity, equity, and inclusion, how to be an ally, lots of training, web-based, and so on. Excuse me, I don't know why the slides are doing that. We just want to thank you for joining us. Thanks for a special thank you for sharing your thoughts and insights in Guzzy. Thank you for the team, Paulo and Uwa, who joined us moderating the questions on the side. We certainly hope that everybody found this valuable today. And if you want more information, you can find both myself and Ngozi on LinkedIn. And it was just an absolute pleasure to have you and have this conversation with you today. Thank you so much, Ngozi. And thank you everyone for joining us. Have a fabulous Thursday.
Thank you.